Hello friends, today we're going to turn this portrait into a cool sci-fi robot looking thing here in Photoshop. And just as always, if you want to follow along, all of the images and assets that I use today, I will leave a link for down in the description below. Today I am using a stock photo from 123rf.com, which is a paid service that I really love using for my YouTube channel and my website. And then for some of the light leaks that we're going to use later on, I am subscribed to Envato Elements, and that is a monthly or yearly subscription, and you get unlimited design assets with that subscription. So it's super useful if you love doing photo manipulations or other design work for your business or your hobbies. Now anyways, with all of that said, you don't actually have to use this exact portrait to make any of this stuff work, because it's going to apply to just any portrait that you work with. So if you have another photo that you've taken, or you have a stock photo from elsewhere that you would like to use, that will also work as well, because nothing that you will learn today is particular to this exact image. It can be applied to just about any portrait photo that you're working with. Now, as for the canvas size that I'm using today, I literally just opened up this image in Photoshop and I'm gonna just work off of the photo. I didn't make any particular settings for my document. Now, the first thing that I like to do with these edits is sort of visualize what I want to do, so then that way it's a little bit easier to wrap your head around what's going on throughout your workflow. So in a nutshell here, I want to basically create a line like this, a line over here, so it's like kind of robot-y, like maybe a triangle like that, and then a few dots down the middle of her nose like so. I might also like to put something down on her chin to make her look a little bit more robot-like. I also want to make this look a lot more moody, so I'll probably have to darken the background and then add some colors around her face just so it looks like it's lit in a cool studio or some kind of interesting environment. So with this general idea in our heads, we can then work off of this to create our robot portrait. So to start things off, let's create the line on this side of her cheek. I'm going to just delete this layer here and create a brand new one, and I'm going to call this to right cheek. With this layer selected, I'm going to grab my pen tool by pressing P, and now I'm going to go create the section that I want the metal to be showing through. So I'll start up here, add an anchor point like so, click down to here, and then I want to add a little bit of a taper, so I'm just going to click down like that, and then we'll go back up like so. So now with our path created, I'm gonna right click and go to make selection. Make sure my feather radius is set to 0 pixels, click OK. With that new layer selected, I'm gonna select a blue color, and then with that set to my foreground color, I'll hold Alt or Option and Delete to fill that layer with that color, and then I'll press Command or Control D to deselect that. Now we have this marking on her face, and we can start to add some bevel and embossing to it. So I'm gonna double click on my right cheek layer, and with this layer styles dialog box, we're gonna go and click on bevel and emboss. Now as for the style, we'll set this to outer bevel, so that's gonna put a bevel adjustment on the outer edge of our line, and then we're going to play around with some of these options here. So the depth will make it look a little bit more noticeable. The size will change, obviously, the size of your bevel, how long it is from the outer edge, and then you can just adjust the softening if you want to have a harder or softer blend into her skin. In this case, I want to have a moderate blend like so. As for the highlights, I want this to be set to white, highlight mode normal, shadow normal, set to black. Now to adjust the lighting of this, we can change the angle here, and I'm going to click use global light, and then now I can just reposition my angle to change where the light is coming from, and I kind of want to match basically where the highlight on her skin is. So there's clearly a light coming straight down onto her face, so I want to sort of match that angle as best as I can. So something like this looks pretty good to me. Now with that complete, we're going to go and click on contour, check that option off, and then click on it to change the settings. Now I'm going to leave the range just set to 100%, and then I'm going to go down to inner shadow. With the inner shadow option, I want to set one shadow on the inside of this main highlight. So I'm going to change the angle to fit up that way, and as you can see, we now have that shadow against the highlight. And then I'm going to bring down the opacity just a little so it's not so aggressive, but then it gives it the look that it's sort of sitting within her skin. Then we can go and adjust the distance accordingly. Now I actually want to add a second inner shadow just on the other side of this blue line here. And in this case, I already have a second inner shadow created, but if you don't have a new one already, just click on the plus icon here, and that will create a secondary inner shadow for you. Now with this inner shadow, I'm going to position it on the other side. So now this is going to be on the inside edge here. So that looks pretty good to me. And then maybe adjust the opacity, bring that around 50%. So now we have a bevel and emboss on the outer edge, and then we have an inner shadow on the inside edge of this blue line here. With that all complete, I'll click OK. And now we have the general positioning of this line going for us. Now the next thing we need to do is obviously blend this in a little bit better with her skin. And the first thing I want to do is deal with this lower part and make it look a little bit darker compared to the rest. So to do that, we don't have to do anything complicated. We can just create a new layer, right click on it and go to create clipping mask. So now it will only affect our shape, and I'll call this to lower shadow. Now I'm going to set my foreground color to black here, grab my brush tool by pressing B. I'm going to scale up my brush a little bit, and then I'll make sure my opacity is set to 100%. Next, using a soft large brush, I'm just going to paint over the bottom edge like so, just to add a little bit of a shadow. Then I'll press 4 on my keyboard to bring it to 40% opacity, and then I'm going to paint once again, this time extending the shadow a little bit further. I'm going to do the same thing now, just with a 40% opacity brush up in the upper corner here, just to add a little bit more of a shadow. If you paint over the same area multiple times, it will get gradually darker, so that's kind of a easy way of going about things. And then lastly, I'll press 1 to set my opacity to 10%, as you see up here, and then I'll just add a more general darkening like that. Now our next objective is to add some highlight and some shadow around the edge of this shape here. And we can do that using a curves adjustment. So creating a curves adjustment layer, I'll call this one to darkening. I'll then go and just bring down the midtones like so, and that's going to darken up our image. And then with the layer mask selected, I'll press Command or Control I to invert it. And then now we can go and paint our adjustments back on where we need them. So with my foreground color set to white, my brush tool selected, my opacity at 100% once again, I'm just using a soft brush, and I'm going to zoom in here and try to go along the edge of this shape as closely as I can. So something like this will work for me. And since I don't want it to cover the shape itself, I'm going to bring it underneath the right cheek. So then that way it is just sitting under here like so. I'll then continue to just go along really close to the edge, just to darken up underneath the line on the shadow side, because the highlight is coming from this edge. If you need to remove anything, you just press X on your keyboard to switch your foreground color to black, and then you can just remove things really easily, so then that way you can just have a nice subtle line. Now setting my foreground color back to white so I can add things back again. I'm going to set my opacity to just 40% by pressing 4, and then now I'm going to just add some subtle darkening adjustments. Turning that on and off, you can see it just adds a nice shadow in there and blends it in a little bit nicer than before. The next thing we'll do is use a similar technique to create a highlight around the other edge of the shape. So once again, creating a curves adjustment layer, I'm going to call this one to brighten. Make the curve adjustment brighter in the midtones like so, and then we'll click on the layer mask, press Command or Control I to invert that, and then now we can once again paint over the outer edge of our shape here. And once again, this is going to be a highlight, so you just want to be subtle and sparing with it. I'm going to just leave my opacity at 40% in this case, and I'll just go and paint around the brightest areas of her face here like so. So turning those two adjustments on and off, you can see it just adds some nice contrast in there and makes things look a little bit more realistic. Now the final thing that we want to do is add some texture to this, because this looks a little bit boring when it's just a solid color. So I'm going to go to my image folder, and then I'm going to select this metal texture. By the way, this is down in the description below, totally free if you want to get access to it. Drag and drop that into your photo. Now obviously this metal texture is fitting everywhere, and we just want it to fit within our shape. So I'm going to drag this up and put it below my lower shadow. And then now we have it within the shape like so. Now to make it have the same blue color that we had before with that metal texture layer selected, I'm going to go and change the blending mode to luminosity. If it looks too zoomed in like it does right now, you can just grab the move tool by pressing V and then just rescale the metal down like so. We have that first one placed. Now let's go and do the other cheek, but this time it's going to be way easier because we've done all the hard work right here. We basically just have to duplicate it. So clicking on the top layer, going down and shift clicking on the bottommost layer that's all related to this one shape, we'll press Command or Control G, and I'll call this to right cheek. With that right cheek group selected, I'll press Command or Control J to duplicate it, That's going to create an exact copy. Then I'll press Command or Control T, right click and go to flip horizontal. Now we have a duplicate version and we can take this over here to this side of our face. And that looks pretty good to me position wise. We obviously will have to do a little bit of refining here, but it's really easy to do. The first thing is we need to, of course, remove this bottom part. So I'm going to click on this layer. I'll actually just rename to left cheek. And then I'll add a layer mask, grab my brush tool, set my foreground color to black. And then I'm just going to mask out this shape with a 100% opacity brush until it basically just peers out around the edge of this fabric. And then up in this corner here, you can see it's a little bit too bright. So with the darkening adjustment, I'm going to click on that layer mask, set my foreground color to white, and then I'll just set my opacity to 50% by pressing 5 on my keyboard, and I'll just darken around this outer edge like so. And then likewise, I'll click on the shadow layer and I'll just add a little bit of darkening to the edge like so. Now the last thing we need to adjust is our bevel and emboss, because obviously the shadow is on the wrong side. We need the shadow to be down here and the highlight to be up here. We're going to double click on our bevel and emboss option here on the left cheek layer. And then we just need to go to the angle and then just reposition it to the opposite side like so. And then now we have our two lines in position. Of course, these will blend in a lot better later on when we do our overall blending adjustments. Right now, we're just getting everything into position. Now, the next thing we need to do is create a triangle with a similar sort of texture up in her forehead here. And so I'm gonna grab my pen tool and I'll just create an anchor point just outside of the canvas, click down right near her eyebrows, and then click back up on the outside of the canvas, connect to the starting point, right click, go to make selection, and then set the feather radius to 0 pixels, click OK. And then with this created, we're going to go and stroke this path. But first we need to just do a little bit of layer housekeeping. So I'll call this to left cheek, and then I'll create a new layer for all of our triangle adjustments. Now we'll go up to edit, down here to stroke. This will add a stroke to our path here. I'm going to set my color to the same blue color as before. I can just click on that blue and it will sample it for me. And then I'll set the location to center and I'll set the width to 30. And then now we have an outline on her forehead. We'll press Command and Control D to deselect that selection. And now we need to go and add some similar adjustments as we have done with these other things down here. Luckily, we can just copy and paste these effects over to our triangle. So holding Alt or Option, clicking on the effects option here, and then dragging up to your triangle layer. That's going to drop those onto your triangle without removing them from your original layer. So it's just going to save you a lot of time here. I'll call this layer to forehead, and then we'll go and double check that everything is looking as it should. Now with this bevel and emboss, I think it looks good enough for me. The only thing I might adjust is just the inner shadow, changing the angle of that just to sit on the other edge there. And then I might also just increase the distance a little bit so it's a bit more noticeable. And then I'll click on the other inner shadow option and just play around with where that is coming from as well. Next, we'll go and add our shadow and highlight adjustments. So I'm going to, once again, create a curves adjustment layer, drag it underneath the forehead layer. I'll call this one to darken. Then we'll click on the curves, bring down the midtones, click on the layer mask, press Command and Control I to invert it, grab the brush tool, then set your foreground color to white. I'll put my opacity just at 50% here, and then I'm going to paint around any areas that I need to look darker, which in this case are going to be the outer edge opposite of the highlight, which is coming straight down from above. Now, after your darkening adjustments are added, create one more curves adjustment, bring this up to brighten, click on the layer mask, press Command and Control I to invert that mask. Once again, brush tool, white brush so that we can add onto our layer, and then we're going to paint around the highlight areas this time. And I'm only using a 30% opacity brush for this, so it's going to be really subtle where the highlights are added. Now that our brightening and darkening adjustments have been added around our shape, let's go and add some shadows to the outer edges of our triangle. So creating a new layer, right-clicking, creating a clipping mask, call this layer to shadow, set our foreground color to black by clicking there, foreground color to black, okay. And then with my brush tool selected, I'm going to set my opacity to 100%, and then I will just paint lightly with a soft brush up in the upper corners here, so I can darken it a lot at the starting point, and then we're going to set the opacity now to 40% with a slightly larger brush, This time it's just going to extend that darkening, but in a nice soft manner. And you kind of just want it to match whatever shadows you have on the subject's skin. So in this case, you can see how the shadow extends down to here. So I want the shadow of the shape to also extend to that area as well. Now to finish everything off, we'll add our metal texture, dragging and dropping that, creating a clipping mask by right-clicking, going to create clipping mask. I'll drag this underneath the shadow layer, so that way it's being affected. And then we'll set the layer blending mode from normal to luminosity, like so. And then if you want, you can readjust the size so it's not so zoomed in with the texture just by using the move tool. Since we're working with so many different layers and a lot of them are the same names or similar adjustments, it would get really confusing if you're not grouping things. So I highly recommend doing that like I am here. Now our next step in the process is adding the 3 dots somewhere down the bridge of her nose, and we can do that pretty easily with the elliptical marquee tool. So creating a new layer above all of our groups, we're going to select the elliptical marquee tool. This allows you to make circular or oval shaped selections. And we're going to zoom in and we're going to create a few different circles here. So I'll just click and drag out like so to create one oval right about here. Then I'm going to hold the shift key, so that will allow me to add to this selection. This will just make life easy, so you can do it all at once rather than across multiple layers. And then I'll just click and drag out once again, holding the space bar to reposition the whole thing at once. And then I'll add one more. This time it's going to be more of a actual circle, still holding the shift key to add that new selection. And then now we have our 3 dots that we can fill with a color. In this case, I'll select a white-ish color like this, click OK, and then I'll hold Alt or Option and Delete to fill that selection with that foreground color on that new layer. Press Command or Control D to deselect, and I'll grab my Move tool and just change the angle of them a little because I messed up and didn't make them perfectly centered, but oh well, it is what it is. Nothing that the Move tool can't fix, am I right? So now with those in place, let's go and add some bevel and emboss adjustments once again. So I'll call this layer to Nose, and then I'll double click on it, and we're going to click on the bevel and emboss, and all of these settings will match whatever you've been adding to your other shapes. So you can just leave it set as is. And then I'll go to the inner shadow, and I just want to add an inner shadow to the top side. So I'm going to set the angle up above like so. And then I'll bring the opacity relatively high so it's quite noticeable. And then I'm going to bring the distance back a little bit so it's really subtle. Something like this looks good to me. So this way it looks like it's sort of embedded in her skin once again. Now we need to go and add this same metal texture to these 3 circles. Dragging and dropping the metal texture image in like so, I'll right click and go to create clipping mask above the nose layer. That's going to add that texture in for me. And then I will just grab my move tool by pressing V and then rescale this so the texture just doesn't look super zoomed in. We'll then go and change the metal texture blending mode from normal to luminosity once again. If you're happy with the color here, you can just leave it as is. However, in this case, I'm not, so I'm going to hold Command or Control and click on the nose group like so to create a selection of those circles. And then now we can go and pick a color. I'll choose something like this orange color here. And then with that nose layer selected, I'll hold Alt or Option and Delete to fill it with that color like so. Press Command or Control D. And then now you have that updated color. I might just adjust this color a little bit more until I'm happy with the result, maybe add a bit more brown. Now I'm not really happy with the exposure of this metal on her nose, so I'll create a curves adjustment layer above my metal texture, create a clipping mask. So I'll just click in the midtones and drag up just to brighten all of those circles together at once, super easily, just like that. So now we have all of our metal features in position, and the last thing we're gonna add is a little circuit board thing on her chin, super easy. Once again, if you want to get access to this photo, you can download it in the description below, totally free, since it's from Pexels. Now I just want to use this little center part that kind of looks like the Iron Man chest, and I'm going to grab the elliptical marquee tool and then just create a selection around that, holding the space bar to move the entire selection area at once. And with that selection active and that microchip layer selected, I'll press Command or Control J to duplicate it and put it on its own layer. Then I'll just delete the microchip layer and I'll call this to chin. Then I'll just shift click these nose layers, press Command or Control G and call this to nose dots. Clicking on our chin layer now, grabbing the move tool, I'll just scale this down and we're going to position it over on her chin so it kind of gives a more robot-y look rather than just the metal. And that looks good to me right there. I'll add a layer mask like so, just so that we can blend it in behind the scarf. Grabbing my brush tool, setting my foreground color to black so we can remove things. Setting my opacity to 100%. I'm just going to mask out the edge of this so it looks like it's appearing behind the scarf. Next, we'll double click on our chin layer to open up the layer styles. We'll add a slight bevel and emboss like so. This is going to match the same settings as we had previously with our other shapes, but this time I'm just going to bring down the depth a little bit so that the bevel and emboss isn't so noticeable. From there, I'll also add an inner shadow. I'll set the angle to be up above at about 90 degrees, so it's coming down this way, and then I'll just increase the distance a touch like so, and then change the size so it softens it out a little bit more as well. Now I don't want this to be a silver color, I actually want it to match this sort of yellowish rust color. So I'll just create a hue saturation adjustment layer, clip it to my chin layer, click on colorize, so that's going to change the color of the overall layer, and I'll bring up the saturation and then choose a nice orange color. Find whatever color works for your particular image. Now we'll need to brighten that up just a little, so creating a curves adjustment, adding a clipping mask, dragging that up like so. So that looks good enough to me there. I'm happy with that color for now. And then we'll go and add some shadow adjustments just around the outer edge. Now to do that, we'll follow the same steps as we did previously with all the other shapes using a curves adjustment layer. So creating a curves adjustment layer and then dragging it below the chin, so then that way it's underneath the shape. We'll double click on that, then bring down the midtones to darken everything. Click on the layer mask, press Command and Control I to invert that, grab your brush tool, set your foreground color to white. So then now we can paint things onto our image, and then I'll set the opacity to 100% for now, and I'll just create a brush that's about the same size as this little microchip thing, and then I'll just paint around it like so. And the beauty of using the curves adjustment is that if your darkening isn't really showing up that much, you can just go and edit the amount super easily, just like that. Now the last thing I want to do is just create a new layer above everything. I'm going to just call this to chin shadow, and then I'll set my foreground color to black by pressing D on my keyboard. And then with this chin shadow layer, I'm going to right click and go to create clipping mask. I'm just going to paint around the inner edge near the scarf here just to add a bit of a shadow. I'll set the opacity to 30%, and then I can just continue to add a bit more shadow around the outer edge of this shape here. So now with that in place, pressing Command or Control 0 to zoom out, you can see we now have all of our parts added to our photo, and now we can start doing the cool and exciting parts to this edit, which is adding global adjustments, some glow effects, and then of course our light leak overlays. First, I'll just shift click all of my chin layers and then press Command or Control G to group them, and I'll call this to chin. Now I want to do some general darkening, so I'll just create a brightness and contrast adjustment layer, bring down the brightness, bring up the contrast, and then now with that layer mask selected, I'll grab the gradient tool, set my gradient type to the foreground to transparent gradient, and then I'll choose a radial gradient. Then I'll click and drag out from the center of her face, and that's just going to darken everything except for her face basically. Next, I want to go and add some color to this by maybe adding some like blue light effects. So I'll create a new layer, and then with my gradient still selected, I'll select the linear gradient type this time, and then I'm going to choose a blue color that matches the ones that we added on her face already. And then now I'll click and drag out like so to add some gradient over and partially covering her face, because this is going to be used as a light source. I'll then set the blending mode from normal down here to color, and that's going to add that color into our photo. Then I'll go to the fill option and I'll just drag this down a little bit so it's a little bit less noticeable in our photo. I'll call this to right gradient, and then I'll create a new layer, call this to left gradient, and then we're going to add a secondary color coming from the other side. In this case, I actually want just a little bit more blue. I really like the look of that. So I'll choose a slightly darker blue color, and then I'll drag out once again, this time on my new layer, and then I'll set the blending mode from normal down to color, and then change the fill so it's a little bit less noticeable. And I'm just setting it to a really low fill amount, so then that way some of that orangish color is still showing through from our original image, but it is taking on more of a dominant blue hue. Now to blend this in even further, we can double click on our gradients, and then go into the blend if option. I'll hold Alt or Option, click on the shadow blend if slider of the this layer option, and I'll drag this up, and this will basically make the color slightly less noticeable within the shadows. Next, let's go and add some glow effects to the lines here, because I want these to basically look like they have some light coming out of them. I will just create a new layer. I'll call this to glow, and then I'll select a nice light blue color or whatever color your shapes are, just choose a lighter version of it, grab your brush tool, and then just go and paint over the outer edge of those shapes. This time I'm just using a 30% opacity and only go over the areas that are actually in the highlights, so I'm not going to go over the shadows as much. With that same layer selected, I'm just going to increase the saturation of that color, and then with a 40% opacity, I'm going to go and paint over the same area with a slightly larger brush. And then choosing a slightly more saturated version of the color that you just used, I'm going to go and paint over the same areas once again, this time with a 50% opacity, so it's going to be a little bit more noticeable this time. And then to finish it off, I'll choose a very saturated color, still with that same glow layer selected. I'll then set my opacity just to 20%, so it's really subtle here. And then I'm going to use a large brush and just paint over the general area like this. Now with all of that in place, we're going to set the blending mode from normal down to hard light. And then depending on how the result is looking, you can adjust it a little bit more, maybe adding some lighter colors on the outside just to blend everything a bit more. So that's looking pretty good to me right there. So turning that on and off, look at that big difference that makes to add some nice glow effects. Now we can do a similar thing with the metal on her face as well. So I'll create a new layer. I'll call this to nose glow. And then I'll go and repeat the exact same process as before. So just starting with a light color at a high opacity and then working my way through to a more saturated color at a low opacity. And then changing the blending mode to hard light. And then if you need to, you can adjust the fill as well, just to refine the look of those colors a bit more. Next, let's go and add the heads-up display to our eye, and I'm going to be using one that I got from Freepik, and this element is actually free, but there is a ton of other options to choose from, some of which are paid, so you can go over to Freepik, check all of that stuff out, and then see what one you like. Otherwise, you can just download this one that I'm using today. I'll drag and drop this into my photo, and then we'll set the blending mode from normal down here to screen, and that's going to get rid of any of the dark areas of the photo. I'll then add a layer mask, and I only want to keep this centermost part. So I'll grab my brush tool, set my foreground color to black with a 100% opacity. I'll just go and mask out all of the outer details here that I don't need. So now that I'm left with this inner circle, I'll grab my move tool by pressing V, and then I'll just rescale this until it covers up her eye. And then to make this pop a bit more, I'll add a levels adjustment layer, create a clipping mask so it's only affecting the eye heads-up display, and then I'll bring up the shadows like so, and then I'll bring up the highlights, so it's going to make it pop a lot more than before. Then if you want to change the color at all, in this case it's kind of a purpley blue, I want it to be more of a teal, I'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer, create a clipping mask once again, and then within the master tab I can just go and adjust the hue of it as needed, so just slightly more teal, maybe increase the saturation a bit. So now that we've added that to her one eye, let's go and do a similar thing to her other eye. So I'll shift click all of those layers, press Command or Control G to group them. I'll call this to left eye heads up display. I'll press Command or Control J to duplicate that group. And I'll call this to right eye heads up display. Grab my move tool, reposition it over to her other eye, and then this time I'm going to actually make this one slightly larger. And with that in position, I'll double click on the right eye heads up display group to open my layer styles, and then I want to change the blend if option of this layer. I'll drag up the shadows, and then I will just hold Alt or Option to feather that shadow area, and that will basically just make it a little bit less washed out, and then we're only left with those main details like so. Now we have our two heads-up displays in place over her eyes, and she's looking a little bit more robotic now. Now to finish things off, let's go and add our light leaks, which I've got from Envato Elements. And if you don't know what Envato Elements is, it has a ton of Photoshop and design assets that you can use to enhance your photos without all of the work. So in this case, these are some great overlays for adding light leaks. It also comes with a brush pack, and I'll leave a link for it down in the description below. But if you need any type of design thing and you want to save yourself some time, I highly suggest checking out Envato. I love using it, and I know you will too. In the pack that I downloaded, there are a ton of different light leaks that I can choose from. So I'll choose maybe this one for now. and we're gonna add a couple different ones into the photo. Once that's added, I'll change the blending mode from normal to screen to basically hide any of the black area, grab my move tool, and then we'll just have to hold the shift key and stretch this out to fit across my overall image like so. Now I want this to be more sci-fi feeling, not feel like a fire going on here. So I'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer, clip it to my light leak. Then I'll click on colorize, and then I can choose a color, in this case the teal color I want it to match up with kind of what we have going on here. And then I'll adjust the saturation a little bit. And then as for the lightness, you'll want to leave that alone if you can. And now let's go and add one more light leak down at the bottom here. With this next light leak, I just need to rotate it so it comes horizontal across my screen. So with my move tool selected, I'll just go to the outside edge, rotate this around till it's at 90 degrees like that. And then I'll just scale this into position, holding the shift key just to squish it a little bit. And I'll do something like this. And then now we'll set the blending mode down to screen to get rid of that black. Now we don't want this to be a red color, so I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer, create a clipping mask, and then I'll press colorize once again. This time I'm going to choose a slightly different color to complement that blue. In this case, perhaps just a slightly more greenish blue color like that. And then lastly, since there's some harsh edges, I'm going to add a layer mask, grab my brush tool by pressing B, and then just mask out any of those harsh edges like so, so it blends into our photo nicely. Now just to keep things organized, I'll shift click between all of those layers, those light leak layers, press Command or Control G, call this to light leaks. And with that, we have now completed our edit. And let's check out this before and after. It's pretty crazy how we didn't necessarily add a lot to our photo. We just were using some selections, some textures, and a lot of layer styles to create this really cool effect in Photoshop. Now this is an awesome sci-fi look that you can apply to any portrait that you want, and with the help of special elements such as the light leaks that we use today, you can really help to enhance those sci-fi portraits super easily. So if you haven't already, definitely make sure to check out Envato Elements and see what kind of stuff they have and if it would be right for you. If you followed along with today's tutorial, I would love to see how it turned out, so make sure to tag me on Instagram at burnwills so I can show you some love for all the hard work that you put into this edit. Now if you love photo manipulations, then of course hit that like button down below and let me know that I should make more of these types of videos, because I love making them as long as you guys love watching them, so let me know. Anyways, my name is Brendan from BeWillCreative.com, and I'll catch you back here next time for another new tutorial. See you then.